This is a recent video that was published, and unfortunately, it has so many mistakes, and so we're gonna pick the top 15 to cover today.
Other Side of the Truth, a YouTube channel with over 120,000 subscribers. It was run by a Wisconsinite named Dustin, actually, to hell with that. I'm not gonna risk spitting on my microphone. He initially started his channel as a travel vlogger to break misunderstood stereotypes. Then he becomes a top 10 YouTube channel. Then he starts grifting for other countries, where he finds great success in his YouTube channel. His magnum opus, of course, is his videos praising Malaysia for its capability to contain COVID-19. The video was so successful, in fact, that it completely dwarfed the views he garnered from his Somalia videos in the past. So he tried again, making a follow-up video praising Malaysia. And lo and behold, it garnered more significant numbers than the last. It's important to note that while his videos on Malaysia may look innocuous at the surface, his intentions became more and more skewed. After his second video on Malaysia blew up, it gave him an idea. A cynical one at that. What if he can somehow manipulate the insecurities of many Malaysians by feeding them what they want to hear? In other words, rebranding himself as a reactionary poster boy for impressionable Malaysians that don't know any better. At some point, his first video on Malaysia got taken down on Facebook. Of course, the reason why Facebook took down his video in the first place was not because of grudges held against Malaysia. The most likely explanation would be that their automated bots went haywire and flagged videos mentioning COVID-19 in any way. But I digress. What he's done after that is a masterstroke, to say the least. He makes a video on YouTube about it. He deliberately uses specific language cues to appeal to Malaysians of their national pride. Guess what? The gambit worked spectacularly.
But don't you ever underestimate the power of Malaysians. This is frustrating because a country like Malaysia often gets ignored. When you look at countries that did amazing fighting COVID-19, it's all about Western countries or maybe Taiwan, but a country like Malaysia is completely off the map. And I worked really hard to give Malaysia the justice they deserve. And Facebook, which is supposed to be for the people, is not for the Malaysian people. So no wonder a place like Malaysia is ignored, because when somebody actually does a story and shows the great things about Malaysia, it's called false, and Facebook blocks the organic reach and blocks ads.
Many Malaysians rallied against Facebook, believing that there's somebody in the shadows trying to undermine the efforts made by the country. They consider Other Side of the Truth as their hero in the supposed David versus Goliath story. But if Malaysians were to stop and think about what he said afterwards, they would probably come to a realization that he never addressed the issue succinctly. His words are pure rhetoric, designed not to be scrutinized, but to appeal directly to the feelings of whoever's he's talking to. It didn't have to be logical, it just needs to sound good. Unsurprisingly, he used this trick on other countries, especially to countries that gave him more views like Somalia. So that's it, right? The experiment is a resounding success. He got views and ad revenue. Basically, he got what he wanted. So does that mean that he wouldn't be pulling this stunt off again? Yeah, no. Of course he's going to do it again. The grift pays off so handsomely that he just couldn't let it go. Somebody has to milk it for all it's worth, you know? And as long as it pays well, why not? Fortunately for him, he didn't have to wait long to try again. Al Jazeera released a documentary video entitled Locked Up in Malaysia's Lockdown on July 3rd, 2020. This documentary outlines Malaysia's maltreatment towards the migrant workers during the pandemic, how some of them were out of work and forced to live in cramped conditions, with no food and dependent on charities to survive. This is some damning stuff for sure, and anybody with a clear conscience of mind would take this issue seriously and investigate it thoroughly. Unfortunately, this documentary had produced a violent whiplash from Malaysia's government and the majority of its people. What they've done to Al Jazeera and the Bangladeshi whistleblower Raihan Kabir was some of the most disgusting things I've ever seen. Plenty of Malaysians went to Al Jazeera's documentary video on YouTube and absolutely drowned them with dislikes. Their journalists were harassed on social media with death threats aplenty. Their office in Kuala Lumpur was raided by the authorities, and eventually, the journalists and the whistleblower got deported, with Raihan being blacklisted from returning to Malaysia ever again. While all of this happened, Other Side of the Truth decided to show his face again, cashing in on this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Why wouldn't he? The grift must continue. And by God, will he chase that though, even if it means treating people like stools to get himself up the apex. With that out of the way, let's dismantle his arguments, shall we?
Number 15, taking videos and footages of police and military.
I've got my ID. Look, this is my ID. I'm from the press. Again.
This is lockdown area. No camera, please.
But we're within our rights to report from here.
Oh, yeah. But this lockdown area.
Throughout the entire world, you really can't be taking footage of police and military. So many countries that's illegal. Even in the United States, if you took video footage of the security around the White House, that could get you thrown in jail.
Let me ask you a simple question. Does this look like Perdana Putra to you? What you're doing right now is comparing apples to oranges. It is not comparable. Besides, you can still film the White House from the outside. What are you talking about? And also, your point that the entire world not letting anyone else take footage of the police is a complete lie. In the United States, you are protected under the First Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, and this law when recording the police. The recording that kickstarted the United States' most significant civil rights movement in recent times was proof of this. Do you want to know which places that do not allow their citizens to record their police? Countries with dictatorships, that's who.
Well, Al Jazeera thinks that because they're reporters, they're above everybody else.
How? They're well within their right to do so. There are no laws here preventing anybody from recording another person, and that includes the police. Tell me, how does informing your rights to record someone else constitutes as being above everybody else? Oh, is it about that one part of the video where the reporters complained about not being let in through the barbed wires? No. They're explaining the situation to the audience, and I'm pretty sure this is a nice gesture on their part to inform the audience this much. Why the fuss?
Number 14, complaining that they weren't allowed into high-risk areas of COVID-19.
We're not allowed inside these fenced-off areas.
Now, I don't know if they don't realize how COVID-19 works. It spreads pretty easily, and so if they were able to go into an area that was high risk, they could easily pick up COVID-19, especially when you look at the video footage and realize that lots of times they weren't wearing a mask, or they only were wearing a mask. I mean, look at how many doctors who were completely prepared, had tons of protection, picked up COVID-19.
Yes, the reporter was not wearing a mask. In fact, he's not wearing any when there are no civilians around. The reason why the reporter would take off the mask in front of the camera is for the microphone to pick his voice up clearly. Other news outlets do this all the time, yet I don't see you whining about it. You can try feigning ignorance all you want, but you've made one big mistake. You have accidentally shown this footage. Look at that. You can see the reporter wearing his mask and his gloves while interviewing other people. Wow, it's almost as if they're mindful about keeping other people safe all this time.
Number 13, blocking comments. You need to always allow comments, but in this video they have blocked all comments on YouTube. You need to allow people to be able to point out when you don't do things that are accurate or when you do things really biased. But if you don't allow comments, people can't point those out. And I just think as a reporter, it's so unprofessional to block comments. I really don't think YouTube should allow that.
Hey, genius. Guess what? They're not obligated to allow comments on their documentary video. Do you want to know why? Because a lot of people have been hurling abusive messages and death threats to the journalists. Unlike you, Al Jazeera is well within its right to protect its staff. Deep down, you're well aware that these nasty people would not leave behind constructive criticism if given a chance. Instead, they'll leave behind more comments that jeopardize the safety of these journalists. How dense are you to think that an angry internet mob are amenable to reason?
Number 12, complaining that the government never responded.
Several requests to interview the Senior Minister, Home Minister and his deputies were declined.
Alright, Mr. Drew Ambrose. Well, the government's a little bit busy. They're fighting this thing called COVID-19, which is extremely deadly and spreads super easy, and sorry, they probably didn't have time to answer every single question you had because they're busy fighting the disease. So, please, man, get off your high horse. Not everybody can take time out of their life to serve you. Right, dude? Like, have a reality check.
Alright, Mr. Dustin Fundheller, how about you entertain this as food for thought? The government were not the ones busy fighting the disease directly. The frontliners do. The government's role is to coordinate the nation's response against the pandemic behind the scenes and to answer questions from the media. Since they've held press conferences frequently back then, it's natural for Al Jazeera to ask questions. It's their job. If you think that Al Jazeera is complaining about having their interview rejected, they're not. All they did is to inform the audience that the ministers involved declined requests for an interview. Because without that disclaimer, people would be rightfully suspicious of the documentary, asking why they didn't try to interview somebody in the government. I urge you to get your head out of the sand and stop pretending to be this ignorant. You're making a fool out of yourself.
Number 11, forgetting how racism works.
Is this the practical reality of dealing with a pandemic? Or is it racism?
Okay, if you're not aware, racism was mentioned multiple times in the video. How racism works is where you judge a group of people based on their skin color. And in this instance, it would be people of Indian descent or people that look Indian. And if you're not aware, there are multiple Malaysians, actually over 7% of Malaysians are of Indian descent. They look exactly like migrant workers that are both legal and illegal. So if the Malaysian government was racist, they would be targeting anybody that looked Indian, Bangladeshi, or Pakistani. But the Malaysian government specifically was doing things for illegal immigrants. And anyone that was of Indian descent that was Malaysian, they were fine. They had no complaints. So this is clearly not a racism issue. This is an illegal immigration issue. And those are different things. To call it racism is just completely wrong and out of place.
Oh my god, he really just said that.
Number 10, ignoring countries that are extremely racist towards their migrant workers. I've traveled all around the world and I have several friends that are migrant workers, and there are several places where I discovered that people were very racist towards migrant workers.
But you seem to forget that Al Jazeera is the one who pointed out the exploitation and racism towards migrant workers in Qatar. You know, the same country Al Jazeera was based at. A simple Google search would have saved you from making such assumptions about Al Jazeera. I'm sorry, but the way I see it, they're more trustworthy because their track record holds up. For the most part, they stuck to their principles, something that you, as a person, do not have. The only thing consistent about you is your lack of consistency. But why have that when there's money to be made from doing this grifting work?
And actually, in Malaysia, migrant workers are treated better than almost anywhere else in the world. Here, locals of a different country call legal migrant workers lazy, messy, unhygienic.
Sure. You were saying?
Number 9, treating illegal migrant workers like they're all victims. Illegal migrant workers have specifically not obeyed the law and are working illegally. Even in your own video, you have a human rights lawyer, somebody that really supports undocumented and illegal migrant workers. And she points out that this illegal migrant worker didn't do anything and that she can't really support him because he put in no effort to try to be legal.
Okay, did he attempt to go to the Labor Department to file a case against his employer?
And throughout this video, you often show that they are victims when they could have just put in some effort to make sure that they obeyed the law and got a working visa.
That's right. Why don't these migrant workers just obey the law and go get a working visa? It's not that hard. Why do they love being an illegal migrant worker so much? The joy of having white privilege really does blind you, huh? Let me bring you in on a bit of a secret. These migrant workers have little to no protection by the law against being exploited by the employers. Employers often hire migrant workers from impoverished countries like Bangladesh, Nepal, and Myanmar. They'll provide these workers with a pitiful wage and a working visa at first. Then, these workers would find out that their salaries have been withheld by their employers. Once these workers outlive their purpose of being exploited, the employers can simply cancel or refuse to renew the visas these migrant workers have. This, in turn, makes them illegal migrant workers. The employers would call the authorities would haul them to lockup before ultimately getting deported. The worst part about this is that the employer only has to pay the authorities a meager fine, a slap on the wrist. And so the cycle repeats itself. Isn't capitalism grand?
Number 8, saying the jobs that migrant workers are working.
Yeah, I can see you've been working so hard of rushing the video out of the window to really capitalize on that algorithm, but come on. At least try to make it look like you give a shit.
Malaysians don't want to work. And it's probably true. There are several jobs that Malaysians would prefer that migrant workers did. But in the video, you show how there used to be 60 jobs at the market that migrant workers worked. And when they set out applications, they had over 500 Malaysians apply for that job. So clearly, in this job, Malaysians wanted to work it, but their jobs were taken by migrant workers.
Because employing migrant workers from poor countries is much cheaper than hiring local ones. Have you ever thought about that?
Number 7, never acknowledging that illegal migrant workers put the entire country at huge risk for COVID-19. See, illegal migrant workers are working illegally. It's in the name. And because they're working illegally, they're not registered. The government doesn't even know if they're probably in the country or where they live or who they work for, and there's no way to track them. And so with COVID, it's so important to track and trace everybody that gets COVID. For example, look at what China did and what Taiwan did and what South Korea did and Japan. All these countries that were extremely good at fighting COVID-19 were able to track everybody in their country and who had it and who didn't. But when you have 4 million illegal immigrants and there's no way to trace them, you're putting your entire country at huge risk. And putting this in the video is so important because then people can kind of understand why the Malaysian government might be trying to figure out who's illegal in Malaysia, because it affects the safety of all Malaysians.
Talking from the position of white privilege again, I see. As I said before, these illegal migrant workers are prone to exploitation by employers. It's not their fault when they got themselves screwed over by their abusive boss. It doesn't help that the legal recourse for these migrant workers to fall back is so inadequate and abysmal. Surely the employers and corrupt officials who allow them to work illegally are just as complicit.
Number 6, acting like sitting in the sun and getting questioned about if you're legally working in Malaysia is like the worst thing in the world.
He says his whole family, including his son and daughter, were handcuffed and chained together with other children and the elderly under the hot sun. They were only released hours later after authorities verified their documents.
Alright, right now COVID-19 is happening. There are so many children around the world that are losing parents to COVID-19 and are going to be raised without their father or mother. And you are upset that a daughter had to sit out in the sun? I mean, if this is the worst thing that happens in your COVID-19 experience, you are very blessed because so many people around the world would give anything to be able to sit out in the sun a few hours and know that their country is safe.
Hey, did you just lose your job? Come on, cheer up. At least you're not homeless. There are people out there that would kill to just have a roof above their heads. What's that? You can't afford to pay off your bank loans and now you've been threatened with eviction? Aw, shucks, don't be like that. At least your house didn't get firebombed outright, killing your entire family in their sleep. Some people had it worse, you know? Let me reiterate what was being said in that documentary just now. There are children, for crying out loud. Handcuffing them and putting them under the sun is so unnecessary. If one of those kids in that crowd were yours, you wouldn't be advocating for such barbaric actions like you're doing right now. But hey, since you have no kids and you're talking from the comfort of your white privilege, you couldn't care less about what these migrant workers had to go through. And their kids.
Number 5, forgetting that everybody is going through a really hard time right now. It's not just the legal migrant workers or the migrant workers. Malaysians as well are going through a hard time. So many Malaysians have lost their job. So many Malaysians are struggling right now. And to focus that the only people struggling are illegal migrant workers and migrant workers is unfair. Everybody is going through a hard time.
Yes, and this is the perfect reason to treat them like garbage. Come on. Nobody is arguing that Malaysians had it easy in this pandemic. Unlike the migrant workers, Malaysians didn't have the authorities hounding them, rounding them up in the open sun, and being subjected to constant racism and bigotry. Whoever's applicable, that is. Yes, everybody is going through a hard time in this country, but that doesn't mean we can't spare them a bit of our empathy. Is that too much to ask?
Number 4, being very misleading and not always honest. For example, handcuffing children. I really don't think this happened. Do you have any footage? Do you have any proof? Do you have anything more than 1 or 2 people saying it happened? And regardless, if children are handcuffed, I mean, it's not the end of the day. It doesn't hurt them. Oh, big deal. I mean, come on. I'm a dentist. I have to treat kids' teeth all the time. That's way worse and way more painful than getting handcuffed. But I do it because it's for the good of the kid overall. So just because something's inconvenient or unpleasant, not everybody lives in a fairy tale land, but regardless, I think that was pretty inaccurate. You also use multiple selective examples. You purposely pick stories and try to show things that made Malaysia look bad.
And yet, Al Jazeera had shown doctors and aid workers caring for these immigrants in the second half of the documentary. Are you trying to imply that this is somehow a bad thing?
Many Malaysians, especially doctors and nurses, have risked their lives treating COVID-19 positive patients that were illegal immigrants. These illegal immigrants got free care, free food, free clothing, free toiletries, and everything was provided to them.
These amenities were only provided to those who have been tested positive and getting sent to MIPS. Otherwise, they wouldn't have anything else and were left to their own devices. Again, you're deliberately misleading the audience.
And this makes you wonder how many other things were inaccurate in this video.
That's rich, coming from someone like you.
Number 3, mixing up legal and illegal migrant workers. Hey, listen to this.
And anti-immigration Facebook groups have been telling illegal migrants to go home.
Did you catch it? One word changes the entire structure of the sentence, and that's how media can be very misleading. He says, anti-immigration Facebook group, but the page he's showing is an anti-illegal immigration Facebook group. And there's a big difference between anti-immigration and anti-illegal immigration.
101 East investigates why so many foreigners are being locked up in Malaysia's lockdown.
Even in the intro summary, you got it wrong. You're not investigating foreigners, all foreigners. No, you're investigating illegal foreigners. You need to say the word illegal.
Isn't that what Trump supporters say when they bitch about migrant workers from Mexico? Oh, we have nothing against immigration, we're just against illegal immigrants. Not only do they steal American jobs, but they have the gall to go around this country like it's theirs. How dare they? You know these semantics mean little to xenophobes in the grand scheme of things, because the anti-immigration and anti-illegal immigrants rhetoric carries the same sentiment, by which it discriminates against those who have no proper and easy way of becoming legal workers. This documentary was not made to highlight the lavish lifestyle of expatriates who are just like you. This documentary was meant to highlight the squalor these illegal immigrants have to go through. Just because the expatriates are happy with their treatment in this country doesn't mean that the issue highlighted was merely a fabrication.
Number 2, completely not understanding how you fight COVID-19.
Authorities have been carrying out military-style operations across the capital, Kuala Lumpur.
COVID-19 is a time where you need to be strict. You can't allow people moving all around. You need to be very, very strict, because if one person with COVID-19 moves and goes about, they can easily spread it to so many more people. And so COVID-19 is a time that you need to have a military-style lockdown, because that's the only thing that works. It worked in Taiwan, it worked in Hong Kong, it worked in China, it worked in South Korea, and it also worked in Malaysia. And in this video, you make it sound like a military-style lockdown is a bad thing. No, that is an amazingly good thing. And the USA and many other countries in the Americas have not done that, and look at the results. Wouldn't you rather have a little bit of a military-style lockdown and save thousands of lives? I think most people would be in favor of that.
You seem to forget that the reason why COVID-19 cases in America exploded was because of the ineptitude of that orange man. It didn't help that he encouraged his supporters to not wear masks, not heeding the lockdown restrictions, injecting disinfectants into their veins, and so much more. Yes, being strict is how you bring down COVID-19 cases, but you don't necessarily need to have a military-style lockdown to contain the spread of COVID-19. Countries like New Zealand have demonstrated this much. No barbed wires, no weapons, no nothing.
Number 1, never saying the good things about Malaysia. Malaysia is an incredible success story. I would recommend you check out this video or this video. Trust me, they're well done and the person that made them is pretty cool.
Oh my god, just shut the fuck up.
I mean, it was amazing to see how people from all different backgrounds, famous and average citizens, all came together for the good of Malaysia. And I think that's really important to talk about in this video when you're going to be talking about COVID-19. And that was completely ignored and completely wrong to ignore that in making this video.
Except that they didn't ignore the good things Malaysia had done. You would notice if you watched the second half of the documentary, where doctors and aid workers were seen trying their best to care for these migrant workers. It's either you completely missed this crucial point, or you deliberately omitting this point to score some brownie points from angry Malaysians that will never watch the documentary until the end. In short, his video on Al Jazeera is completely weak and abysmal. To think that I wasted 13 minutes of my life watching that dumpster fire of a video and expecting him to say something more than this. I feel ashamed for entertaining this clown for this long. But I have to. I must. Otherwise, he would have kept going with his scheme on other countries and keep getting away with it. What he's trying to exude from the name Other Side of the Truth is trust. Trust in which people can depend on him to report the truth and defend their honor. But many people had to swallow the simple fact that the truth does not always come in a way that makes us feel good. Would it be preferable for you to wallow in a comfortable lie than to confront a bitter truth? The problem with Malaysia's treatment of migrant workers is that it has been this abysmal for so many years. It's not something a lot of people wanted to talk about, but it's true nonetheless. Striving for the best means we have to acknowledge our flaws and fix them however we can. When we celebrate our ability to curb the spread of COVID-19 in the first half of 2020, we should never allow it to blind us from the things we can do better. Unfortunately, we were just too proud. We accused whistleblowers of being liars, jahiliya, and prejudiced. We refused to acknowledge our mistakes. We proudly showed off our racism and xenophobia to the rest of the world over the simple fact that our national pride got hurt. And where did that get us? Well, look around you. From being the best, we have become one of the worst performing countries in handling the pandemic. The things that Raihan Kabe had said in the Al Jazeera documentary was eventually proven correct. And yet, we still demonize him. All Other Side of the Truth had done is to reinforce the pre-existing biases that many Malaysians have, that the problems highlighted in Al Jazeera were never an issue to begin with. He gave them reassurance that whatever points brought up by Al Jazeera was based purely on lies and biases against Malaysia. He wanted people to look at him as this YouTuber that cares about them, bringing light on the little guys to reveal the other side of the truth in Malaysia. Ironically, it always comes at the expense of those who simply don't have a voice. Al Jazeera had tried their best to interview multiple sides for their perspective on the issue. They interviewed a doctor, a human rights lawyer, an employer, local workers, migrant workers, their families, and many more. They even tried to interview government officials, despite having their interview rejected. What does he do, apart from parroting what the reactionaries expect him to say of the issue? I think the difference is as clear as day. And he thought that nobody is going to notice it. It's clear that he's a two-faced liar, dishonest, and should never be trusted. And I hope those from outside of Malaysia watching this video would take his words with a huge grain of salt. Thank you so much for watching this video, and a huge thanks to my new $10 patron, Ladam Beton. If you would like to support this channel financially, Patreon is the place to go. By committing to a monthly pledge, you will be able to vote on the next video that I will be working on, and you will gain early access to videos days before release. If you have a spare change at the end of a month, do consider supporting me there. Thank you. And also, be sure to subscribe. It really does help a lot. That's it for now. And I'll see you again next time. Goodbye.